You can see here, my talk tonight is going to combine, maybe if I put this in, actually I'll just hold it. It's going to combine two things, so kind of two parts. I'm going to start off with giving you a little bit of a background about me, but how my journey and my experience in Jacksonville led me to FSCJ and to teaching this course on the history of Jacksonville. And then I'm going to talk about the goals and purposes of this course. This is a course that we believe is the first time there has been a comprehensive class on the history of Jacksonville offered at any school in the city. Now, sometimes when you say superlative statements like that, you run into trouble, and I have said that at certain talks, and I've had people walk up to me and say, well, in 1963 at Venetia Elementary, my third grade teacher was teaching us Jacksonville history, so you are not the first. And that may be true, but I think, at least at the college level, there has never been a comprehensive course on the city's history before. So I think it's important maybe to share, how did this come about? What are the goals for a college level course on Jacksonville history? And then I'm going to shift and talk briefly about some of the research, primarily that Jennifer did for this class. I'm going to highlight just a couple of examples out of a voluminous amount of research she did that I think really show the possibilities of research in some kinds looking at non-traditional archives. And I'm going to highlight an example that actually has inspired me to write some Jacksonville history. As I'm going to point out here in just a little bit, I am not a Jacksonville historian, but as a result of some of Jennifer's research, I have found myself looking at sources that are just remarkable and that leave me kind of no choice but to try to do some Jacksonville history myself. And so I will conclude with that at the end. So, as I said, let me make sure I get this clicker right. Uh-oh. Kate?
Try the other direction. I will advance it for you.
Thank you. Okay. So, as I said, I want to just make it very clear, I am not a Jacksonville historian. I am not the authority or a authority on Jacksonville history. But, as I will tell you, I became to have a belief in the importance of teaching Jacksonville history and really had to teach myself Jacksonville history so I could teach it to my students. But I was trained as an historian of the American South. David talked about my first book. While at UVA, I focused on the cultural history of the American South from the Civil War to the Civil Rights Movement, in which, though studying the South, I never focused at all on Jacksonville or read a single book that was about Jacksonville or even involved the city, which is its own problem in the historiography of the South, why Jacksonville doesn't figure more prominently. But I'll just leave that to one side. Though I'm not a historian of the city, I am a third generation native, as David said. But when I was growing up, Jacksonville history just wasn't a part of my life. Whether I was in Duval County public schools or in private schools, I never learned anything about the city's history in my curriculum. Even in fourth grade, when I was taking Florida history, and I actually went back to my Florida history folder that my mom kept for some reason, and I went back to look, did we focus on anything related to Jacksonville? And there was nothing there that suggested that we did. I remember field trips to St. Augustine and Tallahassee, but nothing in the city. And so I grew up, and by my teenage years, as I was developing a deeper love of history, I had this sense that Jacksonville was a city that had no history. I always looked at other cities like Savannah or Charleston, New Orleans, or Atlanta. Those were cities that seemed to have deep histories, rooted histories. They had a historical identity. There's some distinctive culture that was unique to that place. Whereas in my teenage mind, Jacksonville lacked all of that. And I remember, Kate, if you wouldn't mind switching to the next slide, when I was in college, I read a book for the very first time about Jacksonville history that in some ways referenced Jacksonville history. And it was this book, which is now out of print, American Beach, A Saga of Race, Wealth, and Memory by a Harper's Magazine journalist named Russ Reimer. And as the title suggests, it is about American Beach in Nassau County, but part of the book is about the black community in Jacksonville in early and mid-20th centuries, focusing on Abraham Lincoln Lewis and the families that built and sustained American Beach. And so here I was just sort of stunned. A major press, HarperCollins, is publishing a book about Northeast Florida history. Maybe this was something that I would be interested in. So I dove in, but when I was reading this book, I read a quote from Russ Reimer that kind of captured my teenage, early college mind and perception of Jacksonville and its sense of not having a history. And this is what Russ Reimer said in American Beach. I have to put my glasses on to see you all, but I have to take them off to read my notes, so they're all just going to be blurry from here on out. Russ Reimer said this: "No one has ever accused Jacksonville, Florida, of putting on airs. It is, in the 1990s, one of the South's least graceful cities. Its sparse outcropping of corporate skyscrapers, surrounded by unrestrained, generic urban sprawl, gives the impression of salted earth, a desiccated soil in which nothing sophisticated or genteel can thrive. Even Jacksonvillians, and especially Jacksonvillians, consider their home a backwater, enough of one at least to require defending against the charge. 180 years, this was published in 1997, 180 years or so after its first settling, Jacksonville still seems like a rambling squatter's camp, awaiting its charter, empty of mission, bereft of history." Now, this is clearly a little hyperbolic, and it's clearly not true, but in a weird way, it kind of confirmed in my mind that I was living in a city without an identity, without any history. History happened elsewhere. Russ Reimer goes on to make the point that this is not true because in some sense, the real vital and interesting history in Jacksonville happened, as he said, in, quote, "the black side of the town," and it was the fact that African American history was neglected was in part an explanation why people didn't realize Jacksonville had an actual history. There are other reasons for this perception, of course. I won't go into them. But it was much later that I began to actually appreciate and dive into Jacksonville history. And in fact, the really beginning moment for me was when I was at Georgia State University. After graduate school, I taught at Georgia State in Atlanta. And though I was happy at Georgia State, in 2015 I saw a job was opening up at FSCJ. And my wife is also from Jacksonville. We wanted to be back home. It seemed like a great time to be back home. We had a brand new daughter. We wanted babysitting help. We wanted to be back near the ocean. I knew about FSCJ and its mission, and I thought, this is a wonderful opportunity to teach history in my hometown. And so I applied. It was because of that job that I began to think about Jacksonville history. And Kate, if you wouldn't mind moving the slide. When I got to FSCJ, or at least I should say when I applied for the job, I got an on-campus interview, and for jobs in academia, you have to give an on-campus interview that generally involves a kind of mock class. And my committee at FSCJ told me, your topic is to speak on the history of Reconstruction and why Reconstruction is relevant. And so I began to think, what could I possibly say that's going to stand out? And I thought, well, what about if I gave an example from Jacksonville history, going back to what Alan was saying, that in many ways you can use Jacksonville history to illuminate themes in national and global history. And so I thought, well, here is an example of maybe what I can demonstrate I would do in my classes at FSCJ. So I gave a talk in my job talk, my mock talk, when I was applying at FSCJ. And I used the example of Bethel Baptist and the split that occurred in Bethel Baptist in 1868 to illuminate themes related to Reconstruction in Jacksonville. I'm not going to go into the deep history here of that split, but in 1868, black members of Bethel Baptist, a church that was started by white Baptists in 1838 but always had a black majority congregation. Those black members wanting self-determination to control their own affairs in their church, who believed that because they were in the majority, the church should be, in many ways, their own church. They took white members to court, and in 1868, a Duval County judge ruled that Bethel Baptist, the name and the property were by rights for black members. And I said, here's an example. In 1868, as radical Reconstruction is beginning after the passage and ratification of the 14th Amendment, black people in Jacksonville are asserting their rights as citizens, advocating for self-determination and control of their own institutions. Well, what does this lead to, of course? It leads to the white members separating, establishing Tabernacle and then First Baptist Church. And so I said in my talk at FSCJ, I gave this talk at the downtown campus, when we walk out of the building at the downtown campus, we see the history of Reconstruction on the landscape in downtown Jacksonville. When my students walk out and look to the north, they see Bethel Baptist. When they walk out and look to the south, they see First Baptist. Why are they split? It has to do with the history of Reconstruction. So I don't know if it was that talk, but I did get the job at FSCJ. And when I got to FSCJ, as I said, it became immediately clear to me people were already doing Jacksonville history, Tim being the shining example of that. But Kate, if you wouldn't mind moving to the next slide. It also became readily apparent to me that FSCJ had a history of doing Jacksonville history. That in fact in the 1990s, FSCJ, as it was then known, Florida Community College at Jacksonville, was a kind of center of Jacksonville history. And I learned from Jennifer Gray that in 1990, one of FSCJ's faculty members, Kathy Clower, helped produce a documentary series that was aired on local television, Jacksonville, The Inside Story, From Calford to Consolidation. And so, recognizing the past strengths of FSCJ, recognizing the current strengths that FSCJ had in Jacksonville history, I began to think, well, what if I began to kind of be the historian who taught Jacksonville history? And I did that initially by simply highlighting examples of Jacksonville history to illuminate big themes in American history, much like Alan said. So if I'm talking about the Civil War, I will highlight what happened in Jacksonville in the Civil War, what happened in Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Movement, and so forth. And I was always struck. My students were most engaged, were most alert, paying attention whenever I mentioned Jacksonville history. And I was stunned, and maybe Tim has experienced this too, but I was stunned by how little my students knew about Jacksonville history. And in many cases, virtually nothing at all. And in addition to that, I had a lot of new students, a lot of new international students. And so I began to think, what better way to acclimate them to where they are now living than sharing this history with them? And so that then transitioned into a course that was potentially going to feature a walking tour of downtown. And Jennifer Gray, once again, did a lot of legwork and research to do a walking tour of downtown to take my history students on. Until one day, our provost, John Wall at FSCJ, said, well, why don't you just create a Jacksonville history course? And so that was about 5 years ago, and then Jennifer and I began planning out this course. And it really began in earnest. The research side of it really began in earnest during the pandemic. And as a consequence of the pandemic, we didn't have access to archives like the Jackson Public Library, the JHS, and out of necessity, primarily Jennifer, we were doing research online. And over those kind of 2 years, from 2020 to 2022, I was the beneficiary of Jennifer's tremendous research, both primary and secondary sources. And I used Jennifer's research to begin writing curriculum for our course. And I'll talk more about this course in just a little bit. But basically what I began doing was writing an online textbook of Jacksonville history. And this is a course in which everything that students have access to is free. I will again point out how you can register for this course at the very end, but this is a course that we want to be accessible to not only degree-seeking students at FSCJ, but community members, retirees, people who simply just want to audit the course. We want to make it as accessible and as affordable as possible. And we also recognize that there really wasn't a good, modern, one-volume history of Jacksonville. The last one, I think, would have been James Robertson Ward's Old Hickory's Town. Before that, you've got to go back to T. Frederick Davis, that people still cite. And so, Alan and I even talked about this, about the possibility of someone, maybe not me, hopefully not me, writing a one-volume history of Jacksonville that we can use in our classes. And we have the outlines of that in our online course. And so all the things that students need are available on our course platform at FSCJ. And though I wrote the, quote, online textbook, it was Jennifer's research that made that possible. All right, so now I'm going to shift in and talk about some of the goals for this course. I'm going to highlight just a few and point out some specific topics and themes that we're also trying to hit on in the course. I'm not going to go over every single topic. I will say that this is a course that tries to be comprehensive. It's a course that begins with the environmental history of Northeast Florida and indigenous history of Northeast Florida and goes all the way into the early 20th century. We don't cover every single topic, but we try to be comprehensive and inclusive in our story about Jacksonville. And so though I'm not going to go through every section of the course, I will highlight some themes here in just a little bit. So first off, the purpose of this course is to fill a gap. A major gap that we have in our curriculum, both in secondary and higher education, and that is students, particularly college students, and those at FSCJ can take Florida history classes, American history classes, and global history classes. So why aren't we teaching Jacksonville history? Why aren't we having local history as a fundamental part of our curriculum? And so filling that gap is one of the goals of the course. But the other thing that I really want to emphasize to you, and I oftentimes emphasize to my students, is that there is no shortage of accessible Jacksonville history. Whether it's reading Tim's books or Tim's website, Psychogeo, whether it's reading the Jackson or Alan's pieces for the Florida Times Union, or going on the numerous walking tours that exist here, if you know where to look, there is no shortage of Jacksonville history. But a college course does something different. A college course exposes students to the best scholarship on Jacksonville and on the South and on Florida. But a college course ideally brings the community together. And one of the first things I do in this course is I ask students to write their personal Jacksonville history. Write their life history. Why do you live in Jacksonville? Whether you're native or you just arrived in the city 2 weeks ago, your story is a part of Jacksonville history. And so we begin to share our Jacksonville stories, and then we weave those stories together and create a kind of class history of Jacksonville. And invariably, we can point to themes in our class history of Jacksonville based on our individual stories that relate to the broader history of Jacksonville. And then suddenly students see their fundamental part in this city's history. It is also important, I think, to bring students together to debate and discuss Jacksonville history and its relevance. I'll just highlight one example here in the course. When we talk about Jacksonville as a new South City, yes, we talk about the history of Confederate monuments, a topic that has clearly been a controversial one in our city. Why were they put up when they were put up? What purpose did they serve? How does this relate to the broader history of monument building in the nation, not just in the South, but in the nation during this time? And the point of that is to get students to think historically about topics and debates that are happening in the city today. Not to take a side, but to emphasize to students it's critically important to be historically informed when you're debating policies, and that can be about whether or not monuments should be up, or any other policy affecting our lives today in the city that has a historical root. So why not begin to think about the historical precedent behind those issues as a class, as a community? And so that is one thing I think this course can do. Bring people together, show those intimate ties that bind us together in this place, and then get us speaking humanely about the history behind oftentimes very controversial topics. The third thing I want this class to do is to nurture a stronger sense of place. I've already said how when I was growing up, I thought I lived in a city without a sense of place, without a historical identity. I don't want college students like the ones I teach to grow up thinking that. Jacksonville is an extraordinary place for reasons that I will touch on in just a little bit. But in addition to that, there is a big literature that also shows that there is a direct correlation between civic well-being and historical knowledge. Numerous studies have been said, wherever institutions and cities begin to crumble, and you could apply this to the nation as well, whenever civic engagement wanes, there's oftentimes widespread ignorance about local history and civic history. And so one of the things I hope this course will do will get students to appreciate the history of the city and have a deeper investment in the city's well-being. And this is a quote from John Archibald, who's written a lot about the importance of doing local history. And John said this: "I speculate that if I could find the formula, I could equate the loss of historical awareness with a decline in civic engagement, that sense of common purpose that compels us to consider the common welfare." And so this is a class for some of my students. They will be doing service learning projects, connecting them with community institutions, hopefully even getting volunteers here at the JHS and other nonprofits in this city that do work related to history, getting students to apply their knowledge in partnerships with community institutions. Number 4, and I've just got 2 more before I finish up with the research. The 4th thing that I want this class to do for my students is to turn them into practicing historians who are producing original research. Jacksonville is still fertile ground for original research. There's a whole wealth of topics that have not yet been addressed and written on. Tim's trying to fill those gaps, I think. His books would suggest he's getting close to covering all of Jacksonville history, but there's still a lot to do. And my students, I believe, can become important scholars. And so I want to talk a little bit about one of the goals of the course, and that is kind of shepherding students through the historical methodologies, getting them into archives, and producing original research. And so I just want to share with you some of the projects that my students have done, and then to point out something that Jennifer and I have created at FSCJ, which is a brand new Journal of Jacksonville History designed to publish the best work we have from students at FSCJ. So in the last year, this course was first offered in the fall of 2022. I've had students write on a variety of topics on the city government's effective response to the 1901 fire. I've had a student write a paper on Jacksonville's odor problem of the 1980s. Both of those papers were given at an honors conference last year. I've had another student write a really probing essay on the two-spirit or third gender people and the Timucua culture. Right now, I have a student writing a history of punk rock in Jacksonville, and another student writing a history of the LGBTQ community in Jacksonville in the 80s and 90s. And these are the kinds of work that students are doing, and it's original research based on primary sources or even oral histories. And we are going to be happy to feature that work in Moss Culture. So what I tell my students is when you are taking this course, I don't want you to be thought of as a passive receptor of knowledge, but a creator of that knowledge. And your work is going to have public reach. And many of the best essays I turn around and assign to my students in the course. So their work doesn't just get a grade, it has a life after the end of the semester. All right, Kate, if you wouldn't mind moving on. So the last thing I want to highlight here, one of the goals of the course, is 2 things. They're related. One is to emphasize, and Alan touched on this, but one of the goals of the course is to teach Jacksonville history in a way that it's not parochial, that it's not antiquarianism, where you're just going down and talking about the leading lights and the strange occurrences that happen in the city. But instead, we're linking and seeing Jacksonville history in its regional, national, even global context. What happens at the very local level has regional, national, and even global consequences. And so we look at Jacksonville history through that lens. But we're also asking this question throughout the course: what makes Northeast Florida, and specifically Jacksonville, unique? Now, I know we all could give our individual answers to that question. What makes us unique here in Jacksonville? And this is connected to this idea of emphasizing that students should develop a sense of place, a sense of identity connected to the city. But one thing I want to emphasize here to you, and one of my examples, and one of the things I've discovered through reading and now teaching this class, is one of the enduring themes of Northeast Florida and Jacksonville history is that we are a borderland community. Now, what does that mean? It sounds kind of bland. Well, I'm going to make this argument that this is one of the few things that I can trace back from the time of the St. John's and Timucua people all the way to the present. That the presence of a border, and not necessarily the Florida-Georgia border, the St. Mary's River, but different kinds of borders have shaped the unique history and culture of Northeast Florida. So when I talk about Jacksonville, I'm going to show you some examples here from the course in just a little bit. When I talk about Jacksonville and Northeast Florida as a borderland, what I mean is that borderlands oftentimes are places of international contention. They are oftentimes places where there are disputed boundaries that pit one nation state against another for control of a particular area. And this leads to warfare, it leads to raids, rebellions, uprisings. And if you study the history of Northeast Florida, particularly in the 18th and 19th century, it is a story of frequent invasions, wars, the Patriot War, Seminole Wars, uprisings, the 1795 East Florida Rebellion. The list goes on and on and on. Northeast Florida was a volatile and violent borderland region. But borderlands are also places of interesting cultural diversity. Borderlands often attract people. In-migration and out-migration is frequent. There's frequent crossing of the borders, and people oftentimes are coming to borderland communities like Northeast Florida to find refuge and freedom. We might think of enslaved people in Georgia and the Carolinas who escaped freedom by crossing into Spanish Florida and becoming free and living in communities just north of St. Augustine, living in maroon communities here along the St. Johns River. Sometimes people are coming into borderland communities like Northeast Florida and Jacksonville because they are running from the law, and we attract sometimes an outlaw element that is very evident in our history here. But it also leads to incredible diversity, people from different backgrounds and origins that are not always present in places on the other side of the border, and so to speak, the heartland. So let me just give you a few examples, and Kate, if you wouldn't mind. I'm starting here with our first module, and we're talking about the indigenous history of Northeast Florida. And I will just point out, this is a map showing the geographic outlines of the Mississippian indigenous culture, where it existed in the 11th century. And I will just point out the boundary, the border between the Timucua civilization, the St. John civilization, and then the Mississippian heartland. Northeast Florida, as Keith Ashley has shown us, was a place that incorporated a lot of the material culture found in the Mississippian Indian world and combined it with local artifacts as well to create a distinct culture through trade and interaction with the Mississippians that lived just beyond the border of the Timucua world. Kate, if you wouldn't mind moving to the next one. I have also pointed out and I emphasize in my courses when we talk about the colonial history of Northeast Florida, I oftentimes emphasize with the arrival of English colonies to our north, Carolina in the 17th century, Georgia in the 1730s, the area from the St. Mary's River down to the St. John's River becomes contested territory. Frequent invasions by the English hoping to depose and remove the Spanish. Frequent uprisings here in Northeast Florida, as well as wars into the 19th century, the Patriot War, as Georgians cross into Northeast Florida, hoping to turn Spanish Florida into an American possession. So that theme of the volatility of constant conflict in Northeast Florida is reflective of our unique borderland history. Now, when I move in and talk about the history of the Civil War, I emphasize that borderland idea again. When I talk about the Civil War in Jacksonville, I often tell my students, if you know about the Mason-Dixon line, and many of you probably remember the Mason-Dixon line, the boundary between Maryland and Pennsylvania, and then if you extended it to the Ohio River, separated slave states to the south and free states to the north, I tell my students that in Civil War era Jacksonville, there was a kind of Mason-Dixon line running through the city. Now, why was that? It's unique for a Deep South town. As Daniel Schaefer has pointed out in his books about Civil War era Jacksonville, in 1860, 44% of the heads of households in Jacksonville So the heads of households, 1 year before the Civil War in Jacksonville, 44% were born in the North. Jacksonville had a substantial northern-born population, and this had consequences for the cities during the Civil War. And if you will go to the next slide, Kate, it had consequences for political leadership in Jacksonville, and this is an image I show my students to make the case for the Mason-Dixon line kind of running through the city. This is a list of mayors of Jacksonville from 1849 to 1867. And then this is their place of origin or place of birth. Now, if you go through, it's almost like there was a law written in Jacksonville during the height of the sectional crisis against free states from the north and slave states from the south. Okay, in order for there to be peace, whenever there's a northern mayor, 1 year later, that mayor has to be followed by a southern. And except for this weird 3-year period in the middle of the 1850s where you had what I think were 3 northern-born mayors, that really follows. And that was reflective of this really fascinating demographic situation we had in Jacksonville. And so, of course, as many of you perhaps know, if you know about the history of the Civil War in Jacksonville, this presence of a kind of Mason-Dixon border running through the city's population leads to an outbreak of violence, a kind of internal civil war that happens in 1862 before the first federal occupation, when Northerners, including a former mayor, Philip Frazier, are targeted for death because they aren't thought to be sufficiently loyal to the Confederacy. They're actually waiting for the Union occupation to protect their property. And so Jacksonville has a civil war within a civil war that is reflective of its kind of borderland history. Okay, if you wouldn't mind going to the next. This also extends the history of slavery in Northeast Florida. I could go through, and I do in the class, and point out people who are reflective of our borderland history in Northeast Florida. Isaiah Hart is a quintessential borderland figure, a man who fought in the Patriot War, a man who, of course, goes on to be a slave raider and thief and captures slaves and cattle and then goes across the Georgia border to sell them. But so were people like Zephaniah Kingsley and the Michigan Kingsley. They were people that were only possible in a kind of borderland community. But also Jacksonville's African-American culture, and if you know about the Gullah Geechee culture, this distinctive black culture that thrived and was influenced by West Africa and the Caribbean, that thrived in the coastal sea islands and low country of Florida, Georgia, all the way up to North Carolina. The Park Service draws the southern boundary of the Gullah Geechee historical corridor at the Duval County, St. Johns County line. So once again, Northeast Florida, in terms of culture, is at a kind of borderland or a transition zone of cultures. And Kate, if you wouldn't mind, this extends even into today. This is a map of cultural geographers that were trying to figure out where is the South. Beyond where is the South geographically, where is the South culturally? Where does it end? It has boundaries, so where are those boundaries? Well, these are all lines drawn by cultural geographers. And I'll just point out a few of them. They are pointing out basically in different ways where is either Dixie, the cultural South, or where is the Bible Belt. And so all of these lines are cultural geographers' ways of saying this is the southern extent of the cultural South. And you can see that most of those boundaries run just south of Duval County. And so once again, that boundary, that borderland, that cultural borderland, Jacksonville oftentimes is a difficult place to define because it's in the Deep South, but it's not always of the Deep South. It's in Florida, as Alan was saying, but not always of Florida. And it's sort of that otherness that is reflective of its borderland history and heritage. And even the Southern accent. This is a map by a linguist. We can debate this, of course, but this is oftentimes a generally accepted map for where the native Southern accent ends. And once again, the native Southern accent tends to end right at the Duval County, St. Johns County line. And so Northeast Florida, again, a kind of cultural borderland, making it sometimes difficult to figure out perhaps who we are as a people. In my family, the Southern accent has died out rapidly, but it exists in other parts of Jacksonville today in different ways. But this is a very broad, general map. showing once again the Northeast Florida borderland. Okay. All right, so I'm going to now move and conclude with the research that Jennifer and I have done, primarily Jennifer Gray, and I'm going to do that by highlighting a couple of things. I'm going to highlight a case that I discovered actually when doing research with David on the Jacksonville Community Remembrance Project that was documenting the history of lynching in Duval County. And in the course of doing that, I found a remarkable event that happened in Jacksonville in 1898. But it was a research discovery by Jennifer that has led me to think about writing on this as a project. And so I want to highlight this as an example of the research Jennifer has done and how that research in preparation for this course is leading me to think about finally maybe writing Jacksonville history myself. So what I'm showing you here is a remarkable document. We all know, perhaps, about Jacksonville's history as a center of filmmaking during the early 20th century. As far as we know, the first film ever shot in Jacksonville was shot in 1898, and it was shot at the Duval County Jail, which in 1898 was on the corner of Liberty and Beaver Street. And it was a film of an actual public and, quote, legal execution. Now, when I was doing research for the Jacksonville Community Remembrance Project, I didn't know what to do with this because it wasn't technically an act of vigilante violence. And lynching is a form of vigilante extra-legal violence, whereas the person that is being hanged here, a man named Edward Henson, was ostensibly convicted in a court and was convicted and was a criminal and was sentenced to death. And so this was not technically a lynching. And yet, the fact that this was an event that was filmed raised all kinds of questions. Who was the filmmaker? Who was the person that shot this film? How did he get access to the jail? What does this tell us about Jacksonville in 1898? So as I did research on this, I discovered that this film was shot by a filmmaker named Arthur Marvin. Arthur Marvin was a filmmaker for the American Mutoscope and Biograph Company, one of the early filmmaking companies in the United States, one of the competitors of Edison Studios. And Arthur Marvin in 1898 was sent to Tampa. And while in Tampa, waiting with troops there to go to Cuba to film the Spanish-American War, Arthur Marvin apparently got very bored, was reading the newspapers, and discovered that there was going to be a public execution, a public hanging in Duval County. And so he said, I'm going to take my camera, and in 1898, the camera Arthur Marvin had, that the Biograph Company had, was a 500-pound moving picture camera. He put that camera on a train and took it all the way to Jacksonville because Duval County's sheriff, Napoleon Bonaparte Broward, gave him permission to do something that had never been done before in Jacksonville, which was someone documenting, whether through photography or film, a public execution. And in fact, Jacksonville had begun, like many other places in the South, to shift from public to private to semi-private executions. And so in order to witness an execution, you had to get a ticket and approval from the sheriff, and Arthur Marvin got that. And so while he was there, you can see Arthur Marvin there on the right. That is his 500-pound camera. He's on a ship headed to Cuba, and that's in 1898. That's the inside of the Biograph's moving picture camera. So this fascinated me. It raised all kinds of questions. And I learned that this was not the first public execution to be filmed in American history, but the second. The first one was a year before in Missouri, 1897. A white man named William Carr was hanged, but this was the first time that one had been done in the South and of a black man facing a white audience. It is also, as far as I know, the last time a film was made of a public execution by a commercial film company. And so it struck me as a topic that must be addressed, or in some ways written about in more depth, because it really wasn't in the literature. But while developing this course, Jennifer Gray went and dug deeper. And one day, Jennifer Gray was reading a Wisconsin newspaper that was featuring a letter written by one of the Wisconsin soldiers stationed in Jacksonville during the Spanish-American War, who was at the public execution. He was able to get a ticket from Sheriff Broward and attend this. And while Jennifer was reading this article, she read this paragraph, and it said, quote, this is written about the Wisconsin troops at the county jail witnessing the execution. There was no excitement whatever during the hanging, and at times it was so still one could have heard a pin drop. Tony Palika of the 1st Wisconsin Regiment was there early and secured a good position, and he managed to take 4 good snapshots of the doomed man while he was on the death trap. Before the soldiers left, many whipped out their knives and cut pieces from the scaffold and platform as souvenirs of their first time at a hanging. Now, Jennifer took that reference to this Wisconsin soldier taking photographs of the hanging and began to say, I wonder if there's an archive somewhere online where Wisconsin soldiers left their papers, including the negatives of the photographs that they took. And lo and behold, Jennifer found the Wisconsin Veterans Museum that online had the papers of some of the Spanish-American soldiers stationed in Jacksonville, and then furthermore, she found a folder that had not yet been digitized of the photographs of the hanging. The only hanging that was ever photographed in Jacksonville history. And so when Jennifer discovered this, in conjunction with the film, I thought, okay, there's times when as a story you feel something inside you, say there's something pushing, there's something that needs to be told. There's too much richness here. This story has to be told in some way. Okay, if you wouldn't mind. All the while doing research, we discovered, and I should have shown this a little bit earlier, that in 2015, the film footage of Arthur Marvin of the execution of the Duval County Jail was actually sold at auction for over $4,000. So this historic film, tragically, is not in an archive, but in the hands of a private collector. So while we don't have that, we do have the photograph. And I want to be very clear here. I'm about to show you the photograph that Jennifer found in the archives. This is not an image of the moment of death of Edward Henson. Edward Henson, I believe, was wrongly accused of sexual assault that led to his conviction and then eventually death. But I just want to be clear, the photo I'm going to show you here is not of the moment of death, but before that. But I do think it's historically important to see it in the context of Jacksonville history. So this is the photograph taken by Anthony Palika that Jennifer found a reference to in the Wisconsin newspaper. And I will just point out here that this day, one of the Wisconsin soldiers said the Duval County jail yard was composed of 400 people. More than 2,000 black people were standing on roofs or hanging in trees so that they could view the moment of death. This jail, the Duval County Jail, of course, had very important symbolic meaning, particularly to the black community. In 1892, the black community surrounded the jail. They were armed to prevent a lynching from happening. And so the jail had incredible significance, and the rituals of death that happened inside had incredible significance for the black community, who often saw the jail as a kind of symbol of oppression. I will also point out that on the scaffold you can see Father William Kinney of Immaculate Conception, the pastor at Immaculate Conception, the namesake of who eventually becomes the bishop of the Diocese of St. Augustine. So you have Bishop Kinney, or future Bishop Kinney, then Father Kinney there. He's standing next to the associate pastor at Immaculate Conception, a man named Patrick Berry. I'm trying to do my best to identify some of the others. I know Sheriff Broward is there, standing next to Edward Henson, who will soon be executed, if you wouldn't mind. A few months ago, while doing research, I found another photograph of this execution. And this was on an online catalog from 2002. And I found it on archive.org. And this is another photograph. And as you can see, this one was also sold in a catalog. A private collector has it now. But what I found interesting about this was that there was another perspective here, but that this photograph also contained a portion of the rope that was used in the execution. As you read, and as I read in this description of the event, there was a rush to collect portions of the scaffold, portions of the rope. This was a frequent occurrence, not just at public executions, but at lynchings during this time. All right, okay, if you wouldn't mind. These were some of the people involved, and so in some sense, the essay I'm hoping to write is a kind of history of the witnesses, the people who were there that day. Sister Marianne, a luminous figure in Jacksonville history that many of you might be aware of, she was part of the Sisters of St. Joseph and was renowned for many things in Jacksonville history, but for the care and even love she showed to criminals. She was with Edward Henson in the days leading up to his execution. Father William Kinney also provided succor to potential victims or victims of executions. This is a story, of course, that involves Sheriff Broward as well. And so, again, I'm trying to tell a human story as much as I can, reconstructing the life of Edward Henson as well. So maybe at some point when this project is done, that can be something I come back and talk about if there is interest. Because I also want to finish with one more slide, Kate, and that is, this happens just 2 weeks after the dedication of the Confederate monument in St. James, eventually Hemming, and then James Weldon Johnson Park. And many of the soldiers who witnessed the execution of Edward Henson were present and participated in the dedication of the Confederate monument. Now, I'm not making some causal relationship between the two events, but it shows you this remarkable kind of summer of 1898 in Jacksonville, and how, because of the Spanish-American War, because of the timing of the dedication of the Confederate monument, and then the execution of Edward Henson, there's this concentration of ritual and symbolism that I think reveals a lot, not only about Jacksonville in 1898, but also about the nation, about the South during the late 19th century as well. If anyone is interested in ever taking this course, and again, you do not have to be an FSCJ degree-seeking student to do that, I would encourage you to reach out to me, and hopefully that email address will be up. And I'm sorry I don't have a card, but if you want to come up and take a photograph of that, just let me know, and I'll be sure to send you information about registering and about what you might need to do to take the course. So I hope, again, y'all will be interested in doing that. Hopefully it will be offered for a long time, so there's no particular rush, but if you would like to do that, don't hesitate to reach out. Thank y'all very, very much.
Professor Matthews said he could take a few questions if anybody has any that you'd like to pose while he's still at the microphone.
Yes.
Speak up.
Two comments. One, I think Jennifer should get a raise.
Yes.
This is really interesting, but I have, did the current political climate scare you or sway you in any way?
We had discussions about it just in the sense of anticipating potential issues with students, but in no way did it shape the curriculum, in no way did it shape how I'm teaching the class. My dean, including Billy Thomas and then our provost, and even our president have been nothing but supportive and affirming academic freedom. And so what I do in this course or any course is essentially say, look, I'm not here to indoctrinate or tell you what to think, but how to ask questions and how to think historically and critically. And so I put those political controversies in context, and then I put them aside, and then we do the work. That's it. Yes?
Was there any interaction, I know a few years ago at Mosh, they did a Sands of Time display.
Yep.
Were you coordinated with that research?
That preceded me. So I was not, the only interaction I really had with Mosh, as David said, was when we did the racial terror lynching exhibition with Paul Boursier. That was featured at Mosh, but I had no connection with any prior history work that Mosh did. Although
Do you know who did it?
I don't, and maybe someone else.
Because they really had a fantastic display to go through.
Absolutely. In addition, absolutely, they had a Neighborhoods of Jacksonville exhibit that was really well done as well. But I don't know that person. That was Paul. Paul was the Neighborhood Project. And Sands of Time? And Sands of Time? Yeah, I can't remember. Yeah, Neighborhoods was Paul Boursier, which was a loss when Paul left.
Well, I think Scott said he would stick around for a bit if anybody would like to chat with him, but I want to thank you all for attending, and I particularly would like to thank Scott Matthews for his presentation. We have a memento of his appearance here tonight. If you'd like to take a look at that, this was something that was created by the JHS to particularly reflect an item that got your attention earlier.
If you don't know, Beggarweeds were a Jacksonville band that when I was growing up, I was a person that was the beneficiary of a club in Jacksonville Beach known as Einstein A Go-Go. And as part of the music exhibit that was recently featured and I saw at the Beaches Museum, there was a Beggarweeds poster that I loved. I think I mentioned this to Emily, if Emily is still here, there she is. I got my old Beggarweeds t-shirt, Einstein A Go-Go, and then the Theory Shop in Riverside back in the 90s. Those were my havens, they changed my life, and so having a poster from Einstein A Go-Go is remarkable. Thank you very, very much.
Thanks to all of you for being great history-minded citizens of this great historic city of Jacksonville, and thanks for coming out to hear this presentation. We'll look forward to having you with us for upcoming programs. More information about those are on our website, jackshistory.org. Our annual meeting is coming up for those who are members on November 9th. And then our annual gingerbread extravaganza will return here to St. Andrew's Church for the month of December, celebrating a beloved Jacksonville tradition that is also the major annual fundraiser for the Jacksonville Historical Society. Hope to see you there. Hope to be in touch with you soon, and have a great evening. Thanks, everyone.